In the last 72 hours, four different officials of the Islamic Republic of Iran have made four contradictory public statements about the most strategically important question facing the country: whether the Strait of Hormuz is open or closed. The foreign minister of Iran, on a Friday afternoon, announced that the strait was completely open for commercial vessels. Hours later, a spokesperson for the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps issued a state television statement saying the strait remained closed and under strict control of the armed forces. The next day, the Speaker of the Iranian parliament, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, publicly contradicted the foreign minister, saying the future of the strait would not be determined on social media. And throughout this entire sequence, the man whom the Institute for the Study of War has identified as the actual decision maker now controlling Iran's military response, IRGC Major General Ahmad Vahidi, has not spoken publicly at all. Four officials, four different positions, one regime. That is not a diplomatic strategy. That is not negotiating ambiguity. That is not propaganda discipline. That is the public, real time evidence that the Islamic Republic of Iran, as a coherent decision making entity, no longer functions. The chain of command has fractured. The leadership architecture has collapsed. And what is left, scattered across hardened bunkers and contested ministries and rival IRGC factions, is a set of competing power centers, each claiming to speak for a state that may no longer exist in any meaningful sense. This is the story underneath the story of the current US Iran negotiations. And it is the single most important piece of context for understanding what is going to happen in the next several weeks. Because what almost no one in mainstream coverage is saying out loud is that the regime that the United States is attempting to negotiate with may have, for all practical purposes, already lost the war it is still ostensibly fighting. It just has not figured out how to surrender. And it may not have a structure capable of surrendering even if it wanted to. Let me walk you through what we actually know about the internal collapse of the Iranian decision making apparatus. Because once you understand what has happened to the regime since the opening phase of Operation Epic Fury, you will understand why every round of negotiations keeps failing in ways that look chaotic from the outside, but are actually structurally inevitable. In the opening waves of the war, the United States and Israel did something that had never been attempted on this scale against a major regional power. They systematically targeted the senior leadership of an entire regime simultaneously. Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic for over 30 years, was eliminated in the first wave of strikes. The senior IRGC command structure, the generals who had run the Revolutionary Guard for 2 decades, who had personal relationships with Khamenei, who carried the institutional memory of how the regime actually made decisions, was hit hard in coordinated strikes across multiple targets. The Iranian Air Force, the Iranian Navy, the drone production network, the ballistic missile infrastructure. All of it was degraded simultaneously in a campaign whose technical sophistication has, even months later, not been fully appreciated in public coverage, but the most consequential damage was not material. It was institutional. When you eliminate the head of state and the senior military command of an authoritarian regime in the same 48-hour window, you do not just disrupt operations, you break the meta rules that govern how the regime makes decisions. Authoritarian systems run on personalized authority. They run on relationships, hierarchies, debts, factional balances that were carefully constructed over decades by the figures at the top. Remove those figures, and the system does not produce a tidy line of succession. It produces a vacuum. And vacuums in authoritarian systems are filled not by orderly transition, but by a race between every faction that thinks it can grab the steering wheel before anyone else does. That is what is happening inside the Islamic Republic right now. And the contradictory statements from the foreign minister, the IRGC, the parliament speaker, and the silent presence of Major General Vahidi are the surface symptoms of a much deeper structural disintegration that the regime cannot publicly acknowledge without admitting it has lost the capacity to govern itself. Let me give you the cast of characters, because once you see who is actually competing for control, the chaos starts to make sense. Mojtaba Khamenei is the son of the deceased supreme leader and was named as the formal successor in the immediate aftermath of his father's death. By all accounts, he is operating from a hardened underground facility somewhere in the country, has not appeared in public, and his physical condition is unknown. He has the formal title. He does not appear to have functional command authority. The Iranian state media references him sparingly in language that suggests his role is more symbolic than operational. The Iranian president, who under the constitution would be the second highest civilian authority, has been reduced to what reporting from inside the country describes as a figurehead. He makes statements, he attends meetings, he does not appear to be making any of the decisions that matter on the war. Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, the Speaker of the Iranian parliament, is the figure who led the first round of negotiations with the United States in Islamabad. He is a former IRGC general, meaning he comes from the same institutional background as the hardliners, but is reportedly more pragmatic, more willing to consider compromise, more aware that the regime is in genuine existential danger. He represents what one might call the negotiating wing of what remains of the Iranian political class. And he is being publicly contradicted by other senior figures within hours of every position he takes. The foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, sits in a similar pragmatic camp, which is why he was the one who announced the strait was open on Friday. He was almost certainly trying to take a position that would lower the immediate temperature, generate diplomatic space, and create conditions for the second round of talks to actually produce an agreement. Within hours, he was contradicted by the IRGC. And then there is Major General Ahmad Vahidi. This is the figure that almost no one in mainstream American coverage has named, but who, according to the Institute for the Study of War, may now hold effective control over both Iran's military response and its negotiating posture. Vahidi is a former commander of the Quds Force, the IRGC unit responsible for external operations, the unit that ran Iran's proxy networks across the Middle East for decades. He has an Interpol red notice out for his alleged role in the 1994 bombing of the AMIA Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires, an attack that killed 85 people, and that Argentine investigators traced back to Iranian intelligence services. He is sanctioned by the United States, the European Union, and Canada. He is, by every available metric, a hardliner of the hardline wing, ideologically committed to the foundational anti-American posture of the Islamic Republic, personally responsible for some of the regime's most violent foreign operations, and almost certainly the figure least likely to accept any negotiated outcome that the United States would consider acceptable. If Vahidi is in fact controlling the IRGC's posture right now, the contradictory statements from the foreign minister and the parliament speaker make perfect structural sense. The pragmatic faction is trying to negotiate a way out. The hardline faction, controlled by Vahidi and the surviving Quds Force network, is sabotaging every diplomatic opening because their continued institutional existence depends on the war continuing. The two factions cannot agree, cannot speak with one voice, cannot send a single delegation to Islamabad with the authority to commit the entire regime to a binding agreement. This is what civil war inside a regime looks like when the regime is also fighting an external war at the same time. Now, let me give you the structural analysis that explains why this is so dangerous. Because the natural assumption, listening to what I have just described, is that a fractured Iranian regime is a weaker Iranian regime, and a weaker Iranian regime is one that the United States can extract concessions from more easily. That assumption is wrong. It is, in fact, almost the inverse of the truth. And understanding why is critical. A unified authoritarian regime, even a hostile one, can be negotiated with. Khrushchev could pick up a phone in 1962 and end the Cuban Missile Crisis because he had the institutional authority to make decisions and have them implemented across the entire Soviet apparatus. That is what made coercive diplomacy possible. The threat from Kennedy was credible because Khrushchev knew it was credible, and Kennedy's negotiating posture worked because Khrushchev had the authority to capitulate to it. A fractured authoritarian regime cannot do that. There is nobody to make the deal. Every faction has incentive to hold out because every faction calculates that any agreement signed by a rival faction may not survive the next internal power struggle. The pragmatists want to negotiate, the hardliners want to fight. Neither has the authority to bind the other, and so the regime collectively signals nothing coherent, even when its survival depends on signaling something coherent. This is why the United States negotiating team in Islamabad keeps coming back without a deal. It is not a failure of diplomacy. It is the failure of the entity on the other side of the table to actually function as an entity. And here's the part that should genuinely worry every serious analyst watching this. Fractured regimes do not just fail to negotiate, they fail to make rational risk calculations. The internal logic of factional competition pushes each faction to take more aggressive postures than they otherwise would, because aggressive postures play well with the regime's most committed loyalists, and loyalty is the currency that determines who wins the internal power struggle. The faction that looks weakest internally, the one most willing to compromise externally, is the one most vulnerable to being purged by its rivals. So everyone competes to look strongest, hardest, most defiant, even when defiance is strategically suicidal. That is the mechanism by which weakened regimes start wars they should never start, escalate conflicts they should be de escalating, and refuse settlements that would have been their only path to survival. Not because the regime as a whole has decided this is rational, because the individual factions inside the regime cannot afford to look weak in front of the others. Now, connect this to what is actually happening in real time. Iran has launched drones at American naval vessels following the Tuska seizure. Iran has fired on Indian, French, and British commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has paraded ballistic missiles with American city names painted on them through the streets of Tehran. None of these actions makes sense from the perspective of a unified regime trying to negotiate its way out of a war it is losing. All of them make sense from the perspective of a fractured regime in which competing factions are trying to demonstrate their hardline credentials to internal audiences. This is what makes the next several weeks genuinely dangerous. Not because Iran is strong, because Iran is fractured in ways that make rational de escalation structurally impossible. Let me give you the historical frame, because this pattern is not new. It is, in fact, one of the most consistent patterns in the history of late stage authoritarian regimes. The Romanov dynasty, in its final years, did not negotiate its way out of the First World War, even when continuing the war was clearly destroying the empire because the Tsar's surviving loyalists could not afford to look weak in front of each other. The Tokugawa shogunate in its final years did not negotiate its way through the Bakumatsu crisis, even when the strategic logic clearly called for accommodation, because every faction inside the shogunate had to demonstrate its hardline credentials to survive the internal power struggle. The Ottoman Empire, in its final decades, made a series of strategically catastrophic decisions, culminating in the entry into World War I on the German side, not because any rational analysis supported those decisions, but because the Young Turk faction needed to demonstrate revolutionary credentials to consolidate power against rivals. The pattern is the same. A regime in advanced internal collapse takes external positions that look irrational from the outside, but are perfectly rational from the inside, given the dynamics of factional competition. And the regime keeps making those decisions all the way down because the alternative, making the kind of compromise that ends the external crisis, would require an internal authority that the regime no longer possesses. I want to be precise about what I am claiming. I am not saying the Islamic Republic will fall this month or this year, or even necessarily that it will fall at all in any conventional sense. Regimes can persist in fractured states for years, even decades, if external pressure is not sustained at the levels required to finish them. What I am saying is that the regime, as a coherent decision making entity capable of binding itself to international agreements, is no longer fully functional. That has consequences for everything that happens next. And the negotiating teams in Islamabad, in Washington, in Tehran are operating in a structural environment that almost no one in public coverage is accurately describing. Now, let me connect this to you watching this in the United States, because the implications of an Iranian regime that cannot negotiate are not abstract. If the regime cannot make a coherent deal, the diplomatic option that the Trump administration is currently pursuing, the Kushner-Witkoff mission to Islamabad, the 72-hour ceasefire window, the ultimatum about power plants and bridges, has a substantially lower probability of success than the public framing suggests. Not because Trump is failing as a negotiator, because there may be no functional counterparty to negotiate with. The deal does not get signed because there is nobody on the Iranian side with the authority to sign it that would not be immediately repudiated by a rival faction within hours. And if the deal does not get signed, the strikes follow. Power plants, bridges, whatever remains of the IRGC infrastructure. The American carrier groups, all three of them, currently positioned in the theater, begin a campaign whose first order military success is essentially guaranteed and whose second order political and economic consequences are deeply uncertain. Oil prices spike, the Strait of Hormuz remains closed indefinitely, Gulf oil infrastructure becomes a target for Iranian retaliation. The American economy absorbs a sustained energy shock that the Federal Reserve has very limited tools to respond to without breaking the labor market. This is the trap. The reason Iran cannot make a deal is structural. The reason Trump cannot wait indefinitely is also structural. The ceasefire has a clock, the carriers have a deployment cycle, the political environment has a tolerance limit. Both sides are constrained by their own internal dynamics in ways that make the diplomatic resolution almost mechanically difficult to achieve. The people around you are watching cable news segments about ceasefire extensions and reading about Iranian threats and missing the actual structure underneath. They are not asking why every Iranian official says something different. They are not asking who Vahidi is. They are not understanding that the regime they are watching may already have lost its capacity to function as a unified actor, and that the contradictions in its public statements are not propaganda strategy, but symptoms of internal collapse. That is the story underneath the story. That is what this coverage exists to make visible. The regime in Tehran is not negotiating in bad faith. It is negotiating in fragments because the regime itself has become fragments. And the consequence of that fragmentation is that the path to peaceful resolution may be structurally blocked, even when both sides would, in theory, prefer it to the alternative. One question to leave you with: if a regime is too fractured to make a deal, but too desperate to surrender, and the alternative is the destruction of its country's infrastructure, what is the rational move for the United States? Negotiate harder or finish the campaign? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one.